Hi, and welcome back to the Sarver Genealogy Project. My name is Dean Sarver. Now, one of the main purposes in tracing my family back as far as possible was not only collecting dates and times, but collecting those stories and those events that helped shape my own history and my own story. And another goal of this project was to connect with others who may share the same lineage as me and help them discover their journey and maybe fill in some of the pieces of their lives that shaped who they are. And I've been able to do that through mediums such as Facebook. I've connected with cousins in other parts of the country who have actually filled me in on some information that was missing on my side. So it's been a great exchange. And not only was I able to connect with new family members that I didn't even know was out there, I was able to reconnect with family that I haven't seen in a long time. So since my last video, which was actually my first video on the genealogy project, I've been able to reconnect with two aunts and an uncle who are the siblings, or rather the half-siblings of my father. And they themselves haven't spoke with each other or seen each other in a very long time. So since the start of this project, through Facebook and LinkedIn, and with a little bit of persistence, a little bit of perseverance, our families have been able to reconnect and reestablish relationships. In this episode, I'm going to focus on my father, Donald Sarver. He turns 83 next month, and I want to get some of his stories and some of his memories on record before they are lost to time. So I ask you to sit back and follow me along in this journey and through the life of my father and through the journey of this project as we move back to our roots on my father's side into Switzerland. Thank you so much for listening.
The year was 1937, and the stage was getting set for a war that would see over 400,000 U.S. casualties. The actors on one side were Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, who had just announced his plans for his intent to go to war, the Emperor Hirohito of Japan, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini. On the opposite wing, we had Franklin Delano Roosevelt as President of the United States, Neville Chamberlain, who just took over as England's Prime Minister, and with his coronation in May of that year, King George VI, also of England. The average cost of a house was $4,100, while rent was $26 a month. A car would cost you $760, but then again, gas was only 10 cents a gallon. Bread was at 9 cents a loaf, and a pound of hamburger was just 12 cents. 1937 also saw the disaster of the Hindenburg, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and the Irish Republican Army's attempted assassination of King George VI. America saw the criminalization of marijuana, and the world was introduced to a product made of pork shoulder called Spam. But not all was lost. The world was introduced to Daffy Duck and Elmer Fudd, the Golden Gate Bridge opened in May, and the new Constitution of Ireland came into force. We also saw the rise of DC Comics, the 32-hour work week initiated by Henry Ford, the first Social Security payment, Dr. Seuss's first children's book, and Disney's first feature-length animated film called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In sports, Joe DiMaggio made his first Grand Slam, and the Detroit Tigers scored 36 runs in a doubleheader. And in the midst of it all, on July 26th, Donald Lee Sarver made his debut. Donald was born to Herbert Leroy Sarver and Phyllis Eleanor May in Springfield, Illinois at St. John's Hospital. Springfield, located in Sangamon County, was home to its most famous resident, Abraham Lincoln. Donald grew up in and around Macon County, attending 3 high schools, Argenta, Macon, and finally Warrensburg, where he graduated at the age of 16 with a high school diploma, a little ahead of his friends since he had skipped the 3rd grade. Here's Donald in an interview in May of this year, 2020, talking about his childhood.
Okay. I was born in Springfield, Illinois. My mother's name was Phyllis Eleanor Sarver. and my dad's name was Herbert Leroy, and I was born in 1937. And my dad done many different things. When living in Springfield, I think his number one job was an iceman before refrigerators came out. But he done a lot of things, and one thing he did is about every year we moved, and my dad would remodel a house, and that was back when they started putting electricity in houses, and they were putting running water and other plumbing features in a house, and this is how my dad paid for rent. He would remodel this house for a year's rent, and so I moved around a lot as a kid. And when I got into school, that continued as I went to 6 different grade schools, 3 different high schools, 2 different colleges, and it was just that we moved around, and so I seen things that I probably wouldn't have seen had I been raised in one thing, but I have no idea what they are.
Donald shared a few stories about his growing up, a couple he had asked to keep private. But one story he did recount was taking his father's gun from a drawer at 2 years old and aiming it at some neighbor's kids. Here he is on that.
Oh yeah, we were living in one of the places we lived at in Springfield, Illinois. And I remember there was several kids, and Mom and Dad both worked, and my sister took care of us, but Leslie, she used to be about 8 years old, 7, 8 years old. And then the neighbor kids would come over and visit and stuff. And at one of these outings, I don't know how this got as far as it did, but I knew where my dad kept his gun. And so I went in the bottom chest of drawers. There laid a gun, and I picked it up, and I couldn't hardly carry it. and I went in the other room, and they were daring me to shoot somebody, and so I tried. And they were standing there, and I aimed it at a couple of guys, and I wasn't tough enough to squeeze the trigger, or I would have been responsible for killing somebody. And I'm always thankful that I was as weak as I was at 2 years old. And I can just so faintly remember it. So some of the details, of that could have been quite different than what I remember.
Donald's mother, Phyllis, died of cancer before she could see her son graduate high school. His dad, Pastor Herbert Sarver, remarried soon after, prompting him to leave the ministry. 2 years after high school, Donald married his first wife, Deanna Ray Johnson, although most everyone knew her as Diane, on December 23, 1956 in Decatur, Illinois. Soon after, Donald began college at James Millikan University in Decatur, then later moving to Muscatine University in Muscatine, Iowa. He was studying for his teaching certificate. But Donald received a calling of a different kind when he began his time in the ministry, following in his father's footsteps. He was ordained as a minister while in Iowa.
So how did you get to be a pastor? I mean, how did that?
Well, when I was a kid, my dad was a pastor, and everybody always said I was going to be a pastor. I was going to be a preacher. You know how, And and so it worked out. It just kind of other young people that I knew from the churches I'd attended. And this one guy, I remember his name was Charles Hager, and he called me to Iowa because he was living in Iowa then. Then he moved me he moved to Michigan, and then I remember following him to Michigan. He called and they needed to preach.
So what kind of courses, classes, or anything that you did to become a...
Well, it was interesting. I remember I actually had the same education my dad did when he first started preaching years before that. And I read and outlined and was interviewed on, I think it was 65 books that I had to read, and then they had the regular questionnaire answered, and I would like to tell you how informative all of that was, but I can't remember a thing I learned.
While in Iowa, Donald witnessed the birth of his first child, David Lee Sarver, born at the hospital in Washington, Iowa on January 24th, 1964. He eventually made it to Clare, Michigan, where he became the minister of a small church called the Colinville Church of God. There, his second child, Dean Sarver, was born on September 8, 1966. Donald's first marriage soon dissolved, and he chose to leave the ministry. In July of 1968, Donald married his second wife, Carly Grace Newman of Clare, Michigan. They eventually settled in Portland, Michigan, where he returned to his plastering trade. He had learned to plaster when he was about 16 and continues to take on various projects even at the age of 82. His first wife, Diane, and their two sons, David and Dean, lived about 20 minutes away in Lansing. Although no longer in the ministry, Donald was quite active in church. He was a Sunday school teacher and ran a Bible quiz program for the First Baptist Church of Portland. It was in Portland that he saw the birth of his youngest child, a daughter, Danya Carleen Sarver, born August 27, 1973. By 1981, having visited a year earlier, Donald set his sights on Colorado, where work had shown to be more available and more prosperous. He moved Carly and Danya to Carbondale, Colorado, about 40 minutes east of Aspen. His son David followed them about 2 years later, and after his time in the Navy and bouncing between Colorado and Michigan, his son Dean also made Colorado his permanent home. Donald had just settled into his new home in Colorado less than a year when he received word that his father died in January of 1982 due to complications of Alzheimer's, a disease that plagued his brother Bud and his third wife, Wilma. He traveled home through a snowstorm to Illinois for the funeral. After the funeral, Donald returned home to Colorado, where he enjoyed the next 20-plus years in an area known as the Roaring Fork Valley, which ran from Aspen to Glenwood Springs. He eventually settled in Silk, Colorado, a few miles east of the valley. Donald remained active in church, even becoming an elder, and dabbled a little in politics, running for office in Silk. Carly passed away of leukemia on September 23, 2002. She was buried in the town of Silt on top of a beautiful hill overlooking the town. She was 72. Next, Donald married Wilma Ann Coates on May 16, 2003. Wilma had previously been married to the brother of Carly, Don's second wife, and both being widows and having known each other for many years, they chose to share their lives together. They lived in Silt for a while before moving to Littleton, Colorado, closer to Denver. Wilma died of complications due to Alzheimer's on December 19, 2014. Donald later married Gertrude Eleanor Smouter, known to everyone as Trudy, on November 5, 2016 in Littleton, Colorado, the city in which they both still reside. Donald had recently become an elder at his church and is still quite active doing handyman work. He is currently remodeling the basement of his daughter-in-law. His two sons live about 20 minutes away in Parker, Colorado, and his daughter lives about 10 minutes away in the same town of Littleton. Donald enjoys spending time with his children and with his grandchildren, although sadly he lost one of his grandchildren, Joshua David Sarver, age 21, son of Dean Sarver, due to suicide earlier this year in January of 2020. Some of his plans coming up, in addition to celebrating his 83rd birthday in July, is to finish remodeling the basement of his daughter-in-law and to travel to California to see his sister June. Also, he looks forward to video chatting with his family, whom he recently got reconnected with. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this brief video bio of my father. Next, I plan to share the life of his father, my grandfather, Herbert Leroy Sarver.